All right, hello and welcome to Real Seeker Podcasts. I'm Dale, the host of Real Seeker Ministries, and today I have a special guest talking to us on the topic of prophecy. My old professor, Paul Bali, is back to have a chat with me. How you doing, Paul?
Hey Dale, good. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. So yeah, just sort of. So I know that you've been on the Ask an Atheist Anything podcast with me, Andrew Knight, and Matthew Taylor. But just for people who are new to this podcast, do you want to maybe take a few minutes to introduce yourself and give us a little bit about your background in that?
Sure. Well, I don't know about a few minutes, but
As long as you want.
yeah. I think you covered the main thing. That I'm your old teacher. I'm a philosophy teacher here in. Are we saying where we are, Dale?
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. Here in Toronto, and yeah, I've been teaching philosophy for about 20 years in a university environment, and I write and do a bit of poetry and music and making a foray into the dramatic arts now. But philosophy is definitely the home department.
Excellent. Yeah, and we'll post up links for people in the audience to check out your work and that sort of thing as well. But yeah, so today this I wanted to reach out to you, and you sort of got in touch. You selected this topic of prophecy. So just as sort of like a starting out, what is prophecy? What are you talking about when you're say that you want to speak of prophecy?
Yeah, I tend to use the term as a handy placeholder term for strange communications, for communications between levels. So, prophecy would be any kind of communication that crosses a significant level. I don't want to say in a hierarchy, but I think of something a little bit like the great chain of being, where there are entities who have more scope or more knowledge or more awareness, and they can talk down to cross over to entities who know less. And for the entity, for the beings receiving the prophecy, and in this case us, we're the human recipients of prophecy. We're receiving information that's very special information. It's information of a kind that we could not get on our own, probably, through any independent investigation. We get it through contact with these I'll just say entities. We can get into specifics later, but in the Christian context, that would be God and angels and any of the beings sort of above us. They see more, they know more, they have greater scope. They maybe see a greater swath of time. Maybe God sees all eternity at once, and so often prophecy is associated with knowledge of the future, special knowledge of the future. But I take that to be just a special, very dramatic case of the more general phenomenon, which is again reception of information that we couldn't get on our own.
Interesting. Okay, so I guess just to sort of characterize that. So in the first place, it's sort of I think you used the term in our class, vertical inspiration. So between levels, and prophecy is like a one-way communication from the higher level down to the creatures on the lower level. So you would deny, like, if we communicate upwards, like if I'm praying, that wouldn't qualify as prophesying, even if God is receiving the message and that sort of thing, or the higher power or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a useful distinction. Prophecy is when we prophecy, we are usually conveying to other humans what we've received on the mountaintop, right? But it's we've received that information. I think when we're speaking out to the entities. I mean, there can be a two-way channel of communication there, but when we're when we're speaking out, it's better to use a term like prayer or petitioning or something like that.
Gotcha. Okay. So what type what type of issues or topics do you think generally these higher powers communicate to us? Like, what sort of insights would qualify as prophecy, or is it just any? If God just reveals to us who's going to win the next game, or yeah, is there
Yeah.
like a
It's just making small talk, yeah. You go up to the mountain top and you receive the message, and it's just, hey, how's it going? Nice weather, right?
yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I suppose the word prophecy just has so much weight to it. I tend to favor its use for the weightier communications. I also think that crossing levels is hard, and that's one reason prophecy is special. It's like a sixth sense. Maybe we all have potential for it, but few access it in a consistent, lucid way. So prophecy's hard. Let's just talk about the contact. Contact between these levels is very hard, and the metaphor of the mountaintop is appropriate. Then it's hard to get up to that mountaintop, and few do it. Few make that climb, and then once you're up there, you can receive, above the static of the city and its electronics, you can receive that clear signal. But it's difficult. Even if you're God and you want to talk to the humans, in a sense, you're omnipotent, but you're in a way bound by the limits of the creatures you're communicating to, right? Unless they too are gods, there's going to be inevitably a loss of signal. Even when you do make contact, there's going to be a stepping down of the power. There's going to be great risk of misinterpretation. You can't give them everything, or else they would just be omniscient, right? I mean, a true pure communication from God to creature would just be a transference of total omniscience to the creature. So in any communication from God to creature, there's a loss of information. And so again, the point is, it's difficult, right? This contact, it's difficult, it's rare, and partly for that reason, I tend to think that when it happens for a good reason. That there's urgent information that has to be communicated to the creature. It's not going to be small talk. That's why there's often a political fruit or output of prophetic contact, or the prophet comes down from the mountain and then they're on fire and they're suddenly seeing the city or the tribe in a very different way, often a very critical way, and they come with commands, right? They don't just come and say, hey, I talked to God, it was cool, he seems like a cool dude. They come back and they say, everything needs to change, and here's how, 10 commandments or something along those lines. There's urgent information in the communication, and so I think the content tends to be dire, and that's why everybody says they want to be a prophet, but it's like everyone wants superpowers, but then they don't understand the burden of Superman or Spider-Man and the prophet too. I mean, it's cool to make that contact, but then it's suddenly things have to be done. It's like in Field of Dreams. It's not just, hey, I'm the overvoice, how are you? It's build it.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a command there.
All right, cool. Yeah, I think I'm pretty much from a Christian perspective, we're pretty much on the same level. There is a sense in Scripture that perhaps on I think you call it horizontal diffusion. So something like just ordinary teaching. Christians might call that prophesying as well. But I think in terms of what we're interested in, I think I like the description you gave. Like there's something special where a higher being from a higher vertical level, so to speak, transmits important or very, very significant information and communicates that to us as lower beings. So I think I'm pretty much on the same page as you. But one last question on this sort of introductory type thing is sometimes I have skeptics that ask, and this is usually in the context of assuming that the prophecies are religious in nature, but we can just sort of generalize it. Why do you think that? Why is this an area of study that was important to you? Is it because obviously the communications are of such an important nature that it's more important than other studies, like studying the scientific findings of the universe or the origins of life or something like that. Yeah, what is it that attracts you to the topic of prophecy?
Yeah, I mean, I tend not to divide it from the broader scientific enterprise. I mean, science is interested in reality. It's a systematic attempt to understand reality through investigation, and there are many channels by which we can receive information about reality, and prophecy is one possible channel. I mean, just in principle, one great way to learn about reality is to receive information from those in reality who know more about it than you do.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, in a way, you're doing that whenever you make use of a scientific instrument. When you look through a microscope or telescope, you're making use of something in reality that has direct access through its lenses to something that you can't perceive yourself. So, in that sense, when you make use of a muse or an angel or a god to receive information about reality, you're doing something quite similar to what a scientist is doing by using one of these augmentations of our sensory faculties. Of course, you want to make sure the microscope is in good working order. You want to make sure that particular microscope or that particular manufacturer has a good reputation, is consistent in its manufacture. And so too, you want to make sure, when you're receiving information from an entity, it has a history of truth-telling, which maybe will be there in the cultural record or your own personal experience. There are important differences in degree, I think, between the microscope and the muse, which is it's easier to check the consistency of the microscope, I think, than the muse, and I think there would be many reasons for that, but one would be just what I mentioned earlier, which is that the prophetic faculty, I think, is very rare. Contact between these levels is very difficult, and so it's harder to establish a consistent record of performance with these communications.
That's an interesting point that you sort of touch upon. Is okay. Well, what are the types of mechanisms then that one of these higher beings can use to communicate with us? And I know from your class you lay out a whole bunch of them, but yeah, just to start off in general, like what do you think are some of the types of mechanisms that a higher being can use to communicate these important messages to us?
Well, in the SETI project, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, I think one of the working premises was that transmission across star systems or even galaxies will be difficult, and the information transferred will be quite condensed or zipped. And one way of zipping information, of condensing information, is to ensure that you're making use of both form and content, or medium and message, so that the medium of your message is not arbitrary, that you're using the medium of your message to itself transmit some information. What I mean is, take the example of pens, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have 5 pens in front of you, you're about to write a letter to a friend in Germany, and you have 5 pens you can choose from: a red one, a green one, a blue one, a black one, a purple one.
just to butt in, we do have emails now, just so you know. But
Oh, that's an old school.
sorry, go
No,
ahead.
you're writing to your friend Immanuel Kant in
Okay.
1787, and you've got these multicolored Bic pens,
Hmm.
on the, one thing you can do is just randomly choose a pen, randomly choose a color. You don't care about the color; you just need a pen, and you write your letter.
Hmm.
The other thing you can do, which is actually um, which allows for the letter to carry more information, is to choose your color carefully so that the color choice itself transmits some information. These entities, when they communicate, they'll choose the form or the medium quite carefully, or that the form and the medium will not be arbitrary. That the medium, the messages coming through, will itself be transmitting some very important information. So what we should expect from higher entities
Hmm.
is that the medium they're using is a medium which lower entities couldn't possibly use. So that the medium itself is already, even before you read the words that are coming through or heard, translated the voice of God, the very form of the voice is telling you right away, I'm not local. I'm bigger than you. I know more than you. I control more than you. Listen up. It's like when someone puts their voice through a loudspeaker and puts a lot of reverb or something on it. Right away, even before you're translating the words coming through the loudspeaker, your ears perk up and you listen. This is right away. This is a public address. This is someone with access to this technology. This is someone this is loud. There's already some information coming through in just the medium. So one of the marks of this kind of prophetic communication will be the pen being used by the god or the muse is one that a human couldn't wield. And so it's almost like a security feature of the transmission. It assures the recipient that this is not a human playing tricks on them, or this is not
So
not
something.
their own mind. Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry. Oh, so yeah, so something like so that miracles, for example, like God, in a Christian context, God would communicate through certain miracles for
Exactly.
certain
Yeah.
purposes.
Yeah. Exactly.
Um,
Yeah. Miracles are always communications,
mhm.
right? The miracle is maybe first and foremost, it's a message of the producer's power. It's whatever the details of the miracle are. It's saying, I am God.
What? Let me ask about some other methods, because one thing that you said is that the mechanism should be through a means that is not available to beings on the lower level. So does that mean you discount things like exopsychic decision procedures? Or yeah, like what could these be communications or no? Because yeah, what do you make of something like that?
By exopsychic communication procedures, you're talking about like forms of divination,
Yeah,
uh,
like
right? Yeah, like
astrology or looking
right,
at the
reading
liver.
reading lines on someone's palm, or sortilege, and these practices. Yeah, these divination practices, I think, um, give us access, ideally. So in true divination, you're reading some medium in the world, whether it's the palm of someone's hand or the movements of a flock of birds in the sky or the movements of the star systems. You're reading some medium in the natural or social world as a communication from an entity. And if it is from an entity, it will be marked by an improbability, right?
Okay.
That the birds should move in just that way, um, in that sequence of movements in response to the question you put out to them.
Hmm.
That their movements have a kind of grammar, a grammatical coherence,
Mm.
which is what's the word? Which is very unlikely by random
Yeah.
or natural Deviant movement alone. That's what marks it as divine.
Okay, so I think again, I don't want to get too ahead of myself because this is the next question. But so, in terms of William Dembski, so it's a complex event, but there's specification based on like circumstances that could elevate something like this, at least potentially. I'm saying elevate this beyond just normal human means. Like, okay,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
that makes
yeah,
okay.
yeah, for sure. Let's say your divination practice, your casually acquired divination practice involves street signs. That over the last 5 or 10 years, you found that for whatever reason, street signs, as you're moving through the urban environment, have been kind of speaking to you.
Yeah.
This way insanity lies, I realize. I mean, there's a fine line between the prophet and the person who's just over the edge and really disconnected from anything real. But let's say you've done your skeptical best, and you've had a few experiences where you kind of put a question out to the world or to the city or to existence, and the sequence of street signs that kind of appeared to you as you're moving through the environment, just they strung together in such a coherent way a couple times in your experience that you had to start taking them seriously as a potential medium of communication, right? Like, so in your mind, I know this is kind of crazy, but a few times I put a question out there and really put a question out there purely and intensely at a time of crisis in my life, and the world spoke back. When people say the world spoke back to me, the next question we should ask is, through what medium, right? It's always, communication has to be through a medium. Yeah. So the universe doesn't just speak to you in abstract. It will have to come through a medium. It'll be a voice in your heart, or it might be through street signs. And anyway, you should be performing a kind of Turing test, right? You should always keep the skeptic alive in your mind, and you should be asking, is this sequence of signs really that extraordinary, or is this statistically expected? Is it expected that once in a while a few street signs as you're walking around are going to coordinate into what seems like a coherent, relevant, time-relevant message? Well, you should perform a really high-level kind of Turing test, right? That is, if it's a God speaking to you, it shouldn't just be, oh, this passes the level of human communication. It should be superhuman communication, which means it should be an ordinary message. It should be, for example, the funniest thing you've ever heard. Just like we turn to Shakespeare for a really high level of wit, high level of kind of awareness and really complex irony, and there's maybe a beautiful soul there that comes through in that writing. And Shakespeare isn't just passing a Turing test, right? Shakespeare's passing some super high level kind of Turing test where he passes. It's like this is something close to superhuman communication. We should expect something like that from these prophetic encounters. It shouldn't just be, hey, I asked the universe, should I quit school and pursue that career in singing or not? And right then I passed a street sign which said, affirmation house.
Yeah.
It was a little storefront church. And it's right, affirmation house. To me, that's not enough. That's something you should not go, oh, okay, kind of interesting, but you should also, the skeptic in you should say, totally expected statistically that once in a while a human is going to put a question out to the world, and the world's going to give something back in the neighborhood of relevance. What's got to happen is, you ask the question, and then you pass the sign that says affirmation house, and then you pick up the dialogue. So you say, okay, city, if you're there, or universe, or God, whoever this is, my ears are open. I'm open to the possibility that there's something in real time now communicating with me. If you are, let's keep going. Show me what you got. Right? You should demand a high level from it, and then it's got to pass. It really does. It's got to prove to you not just that it's there, in real time with you, but that it's really smart and wise, right? Just like when people are chatting each other up in a singles bar, they're trying to very quickly, just like in a 30-second window of an opening, trying to show their soul or show, advertise their humor and their intelligence and their world awareness. You should expect that also from the entity. It's got a limited window with you. First of all, to prove that it's real and there.
Mm-hmm.
It's used to encountering human skeptics all the time. So you should expect that if
I don't think it's encountered David Johnson, my old partner, but
yeah. The way it encounters skeptics is by the skeptic not registering that it's there often. Right?
Yeah. Sorry,
The
David.
skeptic.
I was just being funny.
No, I've been there too. I mean, I've had very skeptical phases of my life, and I honor the skeptic, and he's always there with me. He's like part of my inner cast, and he's always co-evaluating these situations along with the more open parts. It's and get those two engines running at once. It's really, really interesting.
Well, here's an interesting case study that I think might relate to another mechanism, but it relates to what you're saying. So, if you remember in class, you used the example of Augustine or Saint Augustine, if you're Catholic or that sort of thing. And yeah, did you want to maybe? So, what was his sort of conversion experience, and what do you make of the mechanism? Some people call them God winks, or they get direct insight or intuition based in some kind of mundane or mystical experience or something like that. So yeah, if you just want to, what was Augustine's experience, and what do you make of that? Was that a prophecy perhaps, or is it, like, what do you make of that?
Yeah, Augustine, and it's been a while since I checked the original text, but in his autobiography, which was called The Confessions, which he wrote toward the end of his life, he recounts his kind of, I guess we call it conversion experience. I think he was in his 30s, and he had this sort of dark day of the soul, a final breakdown where all the building contradictions of his life came to a head and the breaking point, and he called out to God for assistance, and God answered him, according to Augustine, in a child's voice. A child's voice started calling out in a sing-song manner, tolle lege, which in Latin is pick up and read. And Augustine took that to mean flip open Scripture and see what God's saying to you. And Augustine flipped open Scripture he had handy, and his eyes lighted right away on a very relevant passage, a passage which basically said, hey bro, stop sleeping around and pull yourself together. Augustine was, the contradictions he was feeling was, he was a young man who, I think he had a mistress at that point, and he was feeling the pulls of, the bodily life, but I think there's maybe a deeper part of him which knew that his true mission lay with this more almost monastic Christian path, not monastic, but a path involving a lot of ascetic sacrifice. And so that was the contradiction he's feeling. He calls out to God, how much longer will this continue, God? And the child cried out, pick up and read, pick up and read. He picked it up, and passage said, pull yourself together, which is a good answer. It's like, what are you calling out to me for, Augustine? It's all in your hands. Do it. If you want to do it, do it. What are you asking? Just pull yourself together and take the path that you got to take. So Augustine took this to be a direct communication from God, right? That using the medium of the child. Who knows what the child was doing? The child may have just been playing skipping rope or something, right? A couple of yards over, and but using the child, and then using the relatively random physics of the opening of the book and the movement of the eye to a particular passage. All these are all part of the medium of the communication. Augustine was told by God to pull himself together and become a true Christian. So I mean, it's a very nice example of the kind of thing we've been talking about, Dale. Yeah. Whether Augustine's particular example would pass the test of the skeptic, I mean, that's for Augustine to decide based on some of the nuances of the experience, which probably didn't come through in the autobiography. I found in my own experience, these experiences are hard to communicate. That's why often people are told to keep it to themselves. It's like when you try to tell someone about the cool dream you just had, it usually fails. It's what comes out is just there's so much loss of signal. What was interesting about the dream is actually very hard to transmit in words to someone else's
satisfaction.
To their experience. And it's similar, I think, in the case of these sorts of synchronicities or prophetic experiences. But I don't know. Augustine's case is interesting. I mean, it's you can be a little bit mathematical about it. You can say, well, how many elements do we have working together here? The more elements that are being harmonized to communicate, right? A child, a book, Augustine's eye. Mm-hmm. These things are all being like symphonically orchestrated if they're a divine communication. And the more of these natural and social subsystems that are being co-opted to form the communication, the more unlikely it's just random, right? The more like it is actually a conscious co-option by a higher entity. So in Augustine's case, you've got 2 or 3 or 4 elements, depending on how you carve them up, working together there. So it's not just one thing,
and that would sort of relate to, that's the next time when we get to identifying it. This is sort of what William Dembski calls complexity, right? It's so improbable and that sort of thing. Right. But one thing I'd like to ask you, so even if you remember in class when you brought up Augustine's thing, I think I said to you, or maybe I wrote it in one of my answers, is that in addition to sort of assessing it objectively, there's also this mechanism of direct knowledge or direct insight that comes in it. So in a philosophical sense, that's called a properly basic belief, where God just directly downloads, yes, this proposition is true, or something is true. Do you think that God could communicate through such direct means? And that's what I was getting with the Augustine example, is maybe it wasn't just a calculation in his head. Maybe there was a direct. What would you make of that?
I mean, that would be the real mysterious part of the communication. When people talk about the mystery of God and God moving in mysterious ways, that would be the core of any real mysterious element of the communication. The co-option of flocks of birds and singing children is a little bit weird. It's unusual, but it's very ordinary in a sense too. It obeys all the usual standards of communication theory. It's just got some unusual media. But what you're talking about is something I don't think I have any experience of, but I'm open to the possibility of. It's very mysterious to me.
Would you say even in let's put it this way. So some people would say that they have properly basic beliefs for something like 1 + 1 = 2. It's just an immediate, once you understand the concepts that you talked about, I know, I have this direct immediate knowledge. It's not derived based on more foundational beliefs or that sort of thing. Would you say that you do have knowledge in this way, at least in ordinary matters, maybe not on prophetic grounds, but on an ordinary thing?
The arithmetic case is complicated because we're talking about a possibly just a definitional truth, right? We're an analytic truth, and I'm not sure if that's what I would call properly basic. I think that 1 + 1 = 2 when you understand these words and you understand the function of the plus symbol, and there's a kind of inference going on there based on your understanding of the individual terms in that statement, and we lose the sense of that inference as we've gone through the flashcards. Gotcha. And we habituate to it. And even at the flashcard stage, it's so quick. It's such a simple inference or statement that it's it's like a flash of insight. I'm not sure if it's properly basic in the way I would understand that term, but I'm not steeped in the Plantingian epistemology, so I'm not even sure if I've always been a little bit unclear about properly basic beliefs. I'm open to the possibility, especially in the case of this kind of prophetic, channel crossing or level crossing information, that something really extraordinary could happen. But yeah,
that's what puts the mystical, I guess, element in the experiences or whatever. So
yeah.
All right. All right. One other mechanism? And sorry, just so I know, you don't have any. Do you have time constraints at all, or?
Oh no.
You're good. All right. Perfect. All right. So one other thing. You also taught us about the shamans and procedures and that sort of thing. Do you think God, and I guess that can be comparable for Christians, the use of like prophet type figures, because even with shamans, I think you said that we have modern, like Albert Einstein could be considered a shaman or something like that in his own sense or something. So yeah, what do you make of shamans? Is this a valid mechanism that someone can use, that a higher power could use?
Oh yeah, I take the shaman to be almost an archetypal figure. I mean, a real figure, but just partly because of his deep history in the species, to be the archetype of this prophetic figure. It's like the prophet is what modern civilizational religions clothe the older shaman figure in. The shaman is the primary figure at the tribal scale. And then in different environments, you get different variations on that type. But yeah, the shaman, like the prophet, is one who's got this really active, humming sixth sense, this link. They've made this link.
Yeah.
And they're able to cross levels and to come back, to return down from the mountain to our level with a relatively coherent account. So they're good communicators. They can transmit what they received. And so anyone who's involved in that kind of level crossing dynamic and returns to the tribe with useful, extraordinary information has something of the shaman archetype hovering around them. And so Einstein is like that, right? I mean, he's chasing a beam of light and then returning to the tribe with epoch-making information based on that sort of quasi-astral journey. I mean, it was in his imagination, but obviously he's a very precise imagination to be able to imagine chasing a beam of light and then to return with a revolution in the physical sciences based on that. So the precision of his imagining makes his experience akin to what a shaman might have called an astral traveling.
I always found
the
that
the dynamic is there, right? Up the mountain and then returning with what? With useful information for the tribe.
Yeah, I remember there was a line in class when we were talking about Albert Einstein, because it's interesting. A lot of skeptics will say, they'll sort of reject philosophical or in your head type reasoning. It's all about the empirical. But as you said, Albert Einstein, the theory of relativity, he was doing thought experiments, and that's how he came up with. I think he spent like 15 years, you said, since he was a teenager thinking about this, and just no empirical data. It was all thought. Experiment doesn't mean out of the mental. Is that what it means? Yeah. So, yeah, I found that sort of an interesting thing. So, okay, all right.
Yeah, in the sort of ethnography of the shaman, like in Mircea Eliade's study, the shaman is this type. Again, you see at the tribal level again and again. It's something that seems almost woven into the human species. You put 20 humans together on an island and give them 10 or 20 years, and eventually a shaman figure will emerge, just like a dominant and a submissive dynamic will emerge between. I mean, you'll get romantic pairings, and you'll also get someone emerging who's got this function of accessing something outside the ordinary, and then modulating the tribe's experience through that. contact, and the shaman is often marked from a younger age, right? Like an X-Men teenager. They've got some anomaly in their experience. They don't quite fit in. They're out of it. They tend to be in their head a lot, and in a tribe with a well-functioning lineage of shamans, the elder will often recognize from the next generation the ones who've got that potential. You know, they show the signs of shamanhood, and but in a culture, modern context, which has been somewhat stripped of its shamanic traditions, you might expect that the burgeoning shaman types will have to find their own way a little bit. That they'll just be a little bit isolated, and they'll find their own way into their powers, maybe a little bit later than they would have if they had a guide.
Going through the okay. Well, on the question of mechanisms, then, so great. So you provided a variety of possible mechanisms that you think are valid ways that a higher power can communicate with us. One last thing, do you think so? So you're aware of the four yogas, and I actually think, even though this is I'm a Christian and this is a Hindu idea, I do think that there is some truth to this, that people have different personality types or emphases, and God, this higher power, from a Christian context, that would be God, can use different mechanisms that speak to people as individuals. It's not a one size fits all necessarily. So yeah, I'll turn it to you. Do you agree with this? And also the second part is, there is one path that I'm actually a little iffy on, and this is the use of drugs like LSD that you taught us in class. And to be honest, I'm not sure that is a valid path. But yeah, just you're the guest, so I'll turn it to you. Do you agree that there are paths, different communication paths that are suitable for people as individuals? And what do you make of the drug path? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I like that distinction in South Asian religion between the four yogas. I mean, whether they're 4 or 5 or 400, the recognition that there are these different paths for different personality types. And again, you'd expect that from a higher entity. If they really know more and they're really able and willing to talk down, to come to us and communicate to us, they have to be ready to tailor their message, not just to Earth life and not just to the species, but to make it a pretty personal communication. If they're going to be talking to you, and it's not just a public service announcement, they're going to be talking to you. It's going to be, just like if you talk to a child or a puppy, or you're gonna change your tone of voice, and you're gonna try to center your communication on their experience. And so we should expect that there will be a variety of channels, and they'll be tailored a little bit to individual seekers, that the gods will speak to you in a way that's appropriate to you. In fact, one way they might quote unquote speak to you is just by not speaking to you at all. That is, if there's work you need to be doing on Earth, there's something you've come here for, and your deeper self knows that. But as it turns out, you kind of got a skeptical, pretty deeply ingrained skepticism about the unearthly. Might be that the gods appropriately understand that the best way to communicate to you in this lifetime is by not communicating to you directly, right? By just maybe arranging your environment a little bit, the rat maze a little bit, so you're nudged one way rather than the other, so you're helped in your path or your mission. So again, the gods should be so good at tailoring their messages that sometimes it'll be non-messages. There won't be an active or conscious link to the recipient. I think about that sometimes with the space missions, the great 20th century space missions. It's so interesting that for centuries, millennia, we had looked to the heavens named these points of light after the gods, in fact, identified the gods with these points of light. And it wasn't until we went really kind of deep into a scientific naturalist atheism, or at least agnosticism, that we were able to get to those points of light, get to Mars and Venus. We got there.
Yep.
We sent our machines there, and we took close-up pictures of Mars, of the god. But of course, by the time we took the picture in the 1970s, we no longer believed it was a god. It was just a rock. And but it might be that it's important that we make contact with Mars, capital M Mars, and but it might be that the way we're going to do that is by no longer believing that it's a god, right? And then that will open up a certain ambition in us. It'll open up a certain, we'll lose our reverence for it enough that we'll be willing to go and land a machine on it and poke it and prod it. That's just.
Yeah.
I'm not saying Mars is actually a god, and I'm just saying it's
come
interesting.
Come clean, Paul. You can tell the truth. Don't worry. I saw Wonder Woman, so.
Oh. Are they Martians?
Oh no, the god Ares is supposed to be Mars, the god of war or something is in it. Yeah. So. Okay.
But you had asked about psychedelics.
But before we get that though, so there's an interesting thing, because I do think that sometimes skeptics, you seem to be sort of hinting that, well, once we lose this reverence, sort of like a divine reverence or something like that, then we're sort of free to investigate it or seek out the truth about it. But for me, it's almost the opposite. Like when I highly revere God, that's my version of the higher power. I want to seek out as much information. Like that drives me. The reverence drives me to want to learn more and stuff like that about it. So I think it could be both ways. What do you? All right.
I agree with you too. Yeah, it's as we said, it's there are many paths, right? So one is I've just been emphasizing this really interesting eccentric path, which seems like a non-path. There's so many paths that, in fact, some of them won't even seem like paths. That's how great the variety is. But yeah, I think like in romance, excessive reverence can be a hindrance. I'm not talking about your particular approach, Dale, but it just
it's true. Yeah,
you can see if you over revere woman or a particular
That's a good point. Yeah.
That's not what she wants in the end. Maybe a little bit of that, but there's no possibility of intimacy if there's just that reverence. And so, for the actual relationship to happen, there has to be a limitation of that reverential attitude, and something like that could also apply in human divine contact, right? Maybe the gods are a little bit sick of humans falling down before them and calling out in a strange tone of voice, and the gods want something a little more natural. That the best way to make contact with the gods is not to go into a large hall and amplify your voice with reverb and sing and tone chant, but just to speak in the most intimate, quiet voice you know.
Yeah.
And it's there. Hello. There. That's how you make the contact.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, I think Christians, even in the Old Testament, would, when it comes to like the prophets and stuff, and they were so zealous for these religious rituals and that sort of thing, but that they would sort of point out, hey, you guys are missing the point. That God wants a real relationship with you and that sort of thing, and you guys are emphasizing the wrong thing. So I think you're right, and even for myself, I'm not perfect, so there have been times where your reverence can blind you to the truth and actually interfere with you having a relationship. So that's a good point.
I think Jesus called Yahweh Abba in Aramaic, which I take it was thought a little bit irreverent to those around him. It's more that
it's like calling him Daddy rather than Father.
Instead of Great Father, oh Great Father, and he's like, hey Dad. Like Mork talking to whoever the guy back on the home planet was, and sorry, that's an old reference from the '70s TV show.
Robin Williams, yep.
Yeah, that's right, But yeah. That's I think that's quite instructive. He was able to make that contact and to keep it partly because of that intimacy. It's not casualness. There's reverence there, but.
Hmm. Let me. So the reason I asked you about drugs, and this will be the final question on this section, unless you have more to say, but I wanted to get from you: are there any sorts of mechanisms or paths that you don't think are valid ways for a higher being to communicate with us? So, what one example? I'm iffy on the use of drugs because I see it as somewhat parasitic or counter to the other paths. Like if I'm using a path to God through knowledge, which is sort of my approach, or something like that. Like drugs can interfere with my ability to reason and that sort of thing, or they mess with your emotions. If you're into Bhakti yoga and you come to the higher power or God through emotions and that sort of thing. So yeah, I would be sort of iffy on using something like drugs because I think it works against other paths, and there's this sort of notion that they should be mutually reinforcing. Um, just because no one person is all one thing, right? So like that would be
Yeah.
one reason. Yeah. What do you think there are any paths that are not valid, or and yeah? What do you make of the drug thing?
I think the problem is the word drug. It's this. It's partly the legacy of I don't know. Public awareness, 20th century public influence campaigns, which were trying to draw a hard distinction between legal, usually pharmaceutically produced substances, and the ones which had often fallen from the pharmaceutical industry into the gray or black area legally.
Yeah.
I mean, the word drug, it just covers too much to almost be a useful category. I mean, a drug is anything which you ingest or inject or take into the system through the body that modifies experience or behavior. And so there's a spectrum there. Of course, sugar and caffeine are drugs, very powerful ones actually. But so is breathing. I mean, breathing is life's ultimate. Life is really hooked on respiration, and it has profound effects on the mind body. But we take them to be healthful, to be the very paragon of health. And so in principle, there should be no prohibition on drugs as a possible tool.
Okay.
You have to look at the individual substance and its effects. I think some substances actually increase your capacities to reason or to perceive. Some substances increase your empathic capacities, not just temporarily, but if you're learning from the experience, they can permanently change your empathic understanding of other people and animals and the world.
Yeah.
So no, they can be great tools. Like anything, it's not, guns don't kill people, people kill people, and LSD doesn't disconnect you from God. I think it's the unwise use of it that can, like anything.
I think that's a good point. That there are different types of drugs. And
have you ever tried LSD?
No. I grew up in the '90s, so I had the posters everywhere just say no, and that I've never tried marijuana, nothing like that.
You should have taken a couple of interesting turns down some of the hallways in your high school, even in the '90s. I mean, I was in high school in the '90s too, and there was a lot. Canada, apparently there was a lot of LSD and MDMA around. One of the great LSD and MDMA lab guys from the state, I think he fled the States and moved up into Vancouver sometime in the '90s, and Canada was apparently quite flooded with high quality LSD and MDMA in the '90s, but it wasn't everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to say, Dale, you're in no position to make any judgment about these things until you've tried them, but I kind of want to say that too. It's like these experiences. The famous or infamous infamous psychedelics. They're infamous for a reason. They're very powerful. They have very profound effects on your consciousness for 6 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours, and the power is partly in just how different the experience is from I don't know, ordinary experience, and because of that difference, it is very hard to judge from the outside. It really is. If you haven't,
you're trying to say if you haven't tried it, don't knock it.
I guess so. Yeah, I wouldn't say that with everything. Some experiences are similar enough to things you've done that you can. Maybe you haven't downhill skied that particular mountain before, but you've downhill skied 5 other similar mountains, and maybe you can knock it because you've done something like that before. Now, having an LSD type experience or mind opening is something you can get probably in other ways, and so you don't necessarily have to ingest that particular molecule to have that experience. But in my experience, it was pretty remarkably different. It's like when it hit, something is very, very different now. It's almost like that itself was the biggest lesson of the whole experience. Just to see very dramatically how within half an hour everything can change, even though you haven't changed, and you're in the same room with the same people, but everything has changed. Just having that experience in life is very useful, very instructive, and can be very useful if you're inclined to the mystical path, just to be aware of how different things can get. That can be very inspiring. There's just this other world, a consciousness flip away. Always. But anyway, I think they've been in my own path. They've had a place. I don't know if I'll ever try LSD or MDMA or anything again, but in my 20s, they definitely were quite useful.
Would you say that, given your experience, just out of curiosity, did you have anything that you would term as a prophetic experience, like a prophecy or a communication was given to you, or was it just solely this very radically different experience of reality, like sort of? And I should mention for the folks at home that these psychophysical exercises or experimentation techniques are more than just drugs. Meditation would be another example where people describe this sort of thing. But yeah, just in your own experience with LSD and that sort of thing, did you have anything that you feel is a communication at all from a higher being, or?
Yeah, I think that happened when those communications were already happening in non-psychedelic life. So like in my 30s, I think I really started to take these potential communications quite seriously and start to scrutinize them, and I feel like a kind of calm link opened up. And then the few times since then I've tried, I think mainly psilocybin mushrooms, then the psilocybin experience just really intensified that prophetic communication link. But the link was already there. If I think back to, I was a little bit more skeptical, I think, in my early 20s, and I think it was around then I first had tried psychedelics. And if I remember, there wasn't a lot of prophetic experience that happened in those psychedelic experiences. I didn't come out of my first 2 or 3 LSD experiences a believer in the realm of entities any more than I've gone in. I don't think. I came out more open to the variety of experience and to the idea of there being kind of these levels or realms or just different worlds that can open up to you. But in terms of direct communication links, I don't recall vivid experiences like that. And I think that's why people like Sam Harris, can try psychedelics and not be converted from their disbelief in entities. I mean, he goes in, a lot of people go into even the ayahuasca experience not believing in entities, and they come out still not believing in entities. But once you have a kind of not default, but a grounded belief in the reality of these entities, then yeah, I think something like psilocybin is very likely going to
Gotcha.
intensify it.
Okay, well, that brings up a valid question then. So, like, granted, we sort of mentioned some of the various mechanisms where a higher being can provide these communications, and you sort of hinted at answering this already yourself. But how do you think that we should go about identifying these communications versus the noise or the false communications? Are what
Yeah.
ways do we have to differentiate false positives from actual communications or prophecies?
That's the number one question for the skeptic, right? And not just for the skeptic. I keep using this term skeptic, but it's really for any reasonable communicator. You should have that question at the forefront, at least early in the establishment of any link, right? It's like, is this a link, or is this just my own head? Is this a link, or is this just the just the glimmering of pseudo meaning you'd expect from the random noise of the city's information, or the random noise of natural phenomena like bird movements. So absolutely, you've got to keep that question in mind, and to answer it, you need criteria. And I don't think those criteria would differ dramatically from the criteria we'd use for any kind of communication, right? I mean, you want yeah. So your question is how to separate signal from noise, and the noise here would be just the expected information you'd be receiving from a non-conscious city or a non-conscious natural world, right? And the signal would be the information coming at you if something super powerful was manipulating the city or your environment to say something to you. And I think the whatever the specific criteria are there, you've got to develop as refined a sense as you can of what the background expectation would be. Right? Okay. So randomness will produce pseudo meaning, partly just from the objective math of it, and partly from our own projective abilities. We have this, you talked about false positives. We've been trained by nature to experience a lot of false positives, to keep our ears open, perked up high, and to take a lot of rustling wind to be the whisperings of ghosts. And or for a mother primed by a new child, we're primed to hear a lot of things as maybe a crying baby, when only 2 out of 3 of those things are the crying baby. But I'm kind of dancing around the specific, very good question you asked about criteria. But I think again, if we're talking about human to something, call it superhuman, we should have very high expectations, and so we should expect that what's coming through really does defy that probability of background noise. And it's not regular information. It's not, hi, how are you? It's not it should be a little bit Shakespearean. It doesn't have to sound like Shakespeare with thous and these and shouts, but it should have a wit. It should indicate a consciousness that just seems superior.
Sort of like have I don't want to say divine, because we're not at the who the designer is yet, but right. Sort of like that signature, a higher signature that imprints itself on the message, I guess is. Yeah. And would that be different? So in our class, you taught us about various naturalistic mechanisms, so that people will just, this is human beings have a hyperactive design detector, or you're just looking at synchronicities and pretending that there's a more significance to these when it just happens naturally, or pareidolia, or you gave us various sort of naturalistic explanations. So
Right.
how do you respond to the skeptic that just says, no, all you're seeing is just this? Yeah.
I've come to the view that the skeptic is usually right.
Okay.
That, I mean, just hearing, partly through class and partly outside of it, lots of sort of synchronicity stories and these accounts, and also dealing with my own, as I was, learning the appropriate level of skepticism to evaluate my own experience. I have come to the conclusion that most of the putative communications are kind of noise, or they're human projections. We talked about the shaman being a type, and it's maybe a slightly rare type. It's not everyone will have that ability. Not everyone's here to be a shaman. Thank God, not everyone's here to be breaking through to the other realm and having strange experiences and then coming back to the tribe dazed, maybe, and communicating something out of the ordinary. The ordinary itself is enough most of the time, and it needs correction, needs course correction, and but it takes a lot to maintain it. It's not just maintaining; it's self-evolving, and I don't think most of us are here to have this kind of live, often very disturbing communication link with something outside of us, and I don't think the thing outside of us wants to talk to everybody at once. Or the most effective way for it to talk to everybody is to talk through these human media, these prophets and these shaman and witches and whatever else. There are all these sub-archetypes. So yeah, I think the skeptic is often right, meaning if they're thinking of their own experience, their own coincidences that they thought were weird and were maybe even tempted by for a time into thinking of as synchronicities, and then their sober mind corrected them. That sober mind maybe for their particular cases was correct, that the experience they had in mind really was just to be expected in the background noise. So the standard should be very high, and I think by that standard, a lot of what people get enticed by is really not up to the mark.
I'm just sort of curious though. So I get that you think that most of the stuff that passes itself off as these communications are just not. There is a natural explanation or that sort of thing. Do you think that the context, that the ratio is different in religious context in particular? Are the level of communications any higher or lower, or are the exact same when there's a religious context present versus just some other context? Do you think that religion is just some of our fans will say that it's just an anthropomorphic projection? I think it was Fairbach who said that.
Yeah.
Or you have other things. Yeah. Do you think there's a difference in the religious context compared to other contexts where these communications, or is it the same?
Oh, there's definitely a difference. I'm tempted to say it's an analytic truth that in the religious context we're more likely to have this link, and it's more likely to be coherent and properly interpreted. The footnote there, the caveat is true religion or properly operating religion or healthy religion. So almost by definition, religion is that cultural institution which increases the chances of that link happening, and increases our ability to receive and interpret and put into practice in a coherent way the information from that link. But then the messy sociological or social question is, but where and when is religion actually operating coherently? I think the actual history is pretty messy and pretty depressing. But you do, it's totally expected that certain places and certain times will be more active than others. Certain people will be more active than others. So, I don't tend towards a kind of religious exclusivism. But on the other hand, it wouldn't be that surprising if in the end God chooses a few people for a direct communication, and then zooming out a bit to the cultural scale, God also chooses particular epochs or times to make a very direct communication. That the communication isn't just a wall of sound coming at us 24/7 from every possible surface. It's got some dynamics, and part of that dynamic is on a kind of century scale and across cultures. So just in principle, I'm open to something like exclusivism, but
Gotcha.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, I'll just. I know that you're the guest, and we're getting sort of your thoughts. But in a discussion, I talked to you about sort of my theory for how we identify prophecies. I liked your answer in terms of communication theory and identifying a signature in the message and that sort of thing. I also like approaching this from the notion of intelligent design detection through William Dembski's work is my favorite. He has his notion of specified complexity. So, you know, you go through this. First of all, there has to be a specification, which is sort of a detached or independent pattern to which an event conforms to. And then there's the complexity aspect, which you mentioned, Paul, about it's very improbable. So it passes through the explanatory filter. It's not a highly probable event like a regularity. And then it has to have a small probability. So it's not an intermediate or, sort of sometimes small probabilities are possible by chance as well. But when you have a small probability, that's small relative to its context in what mathematicians call a probability bound, plus this specification, this independent pattern, then what Dembski says is, look, we have this process, this explanatory filter where we have an actualization of an event, we have the elimination of many other possibilities, that's the improbable part, and then it's specified to this pattern. That's what bingo, that's where we get to say there's an intelligent designer. That's what undermines choice, intelligent choice. So yeah, I think when we can identify this in relation to a end goal, a stated goal. So my idea is this: I look for what's called G belief authenticating events, which is essentially miracles from God that are designed to authenticate a religious message. That's sort of been what I've been focused on, and I'll turn it to you. Like, what do you think of approaching this through the design lens? Is that a valid way to identify prophecies or communications?
Oh, absolutely. I think we're very much on the same page there, and it sounds like you've made this connection a lot earlier in life than I did. I think for me it's a much more recent. Just I'm 45, but just the light. I didn't read Dembski, but light bulb kind of went on maybe a year or two ago, where I was like, oh yeah, I mean, what we're talking about with evaluating these communication links is just a species of argument from design evaluation, right? I mean, whether you're talking about the medium of the universe itself bearing marks of intelligent ordering, or the medium of a particular locus of the universe, which is acting as the page the pen is writing on. In both cases, it's the same structure of evaluation.
Yeah.
We would bring to bear on it, right?
And just so the audience knows,
are important in communication and creation. And we were from the designed thing, we infer the intentions of the creator, right? Oh, they wanted to tell time. They wanted to increase someone's mobility. They built a bicycle with wheels, and so you infer the intentions of the designer from careful attention to the designed object. And same with communication, of course, mundane and divine. You're inferring the intentions of the communicator through the communication, and you're inferring that there is a communicator by the inference that there are intentions operating here.
Excellent. And just so the audience knows, I cheated. I talked to Paul before, so I already knew in advance he agreed with me. But but yeah, I think those are interesting ways to approach this, because a lot of times, especially in regards to miracles, I'll find that skeptics get wrapped up in this, supernatural versus natural sort of categorization, and what does it mean to be something supernatural? That's just unintelligible. It doesn't make sense to us. It's like you're talking magic. And if we approach this through the lens of communication theory and intelligent design, which are presumably, that it's not unique to prophecies. This applies at SETI. It applies in patent protection.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, the natural supernatural thing, I agree. In the end, is I almost see it as a bit of a red herring, and a more almost conspiratorial or cynical part of my mind wonders if it's this happy byproduct of an atheistic enlightenment, right? That we've been bequeathed this distinction partly because it aids a kind of naturalist program, right? If you divide reality into the natural and then the possibly supernatural, but this category of the supernatural is so problematic. It's very easily going to just fall to the wayside. And but if we focus more on what we've been focusing on today, which is just communication theory and trying to infer the nature of the communicator from the communication, that's a lot more useful. In fact, you talk about miracles. Miracles were often defined as supernatural events. I mean, events that defy the laws of nature, but
violations. Yeah.
I mean, until you know the total bounds and operations of the natural world, you can't decide what is supernatural. John Stuart Mill recognized that. That putative miracles may just be the operations of natural law we don't yet understand, and he's totally right. It's like Clarke's third law of technology, that an advanced enough technology will seem like magic to a recipient culture, and an advanced enough alien will seem like a god. An alien is a purely natural phenomenon. It's a Darwinian product of another planet, let's say, but it will seem godlike if they land on the right planet at the right level of tribal development, what have you.
I've definitely heard that one.
We can imagine all sorts of violations, actual violations, objective violations of natural law that just are not interesting at all as miracles, and in fact, I don't think we'd even count as miracles. I mean, God could right now manipulate in the far back corner of the room you're in, Dale, could manipulate one particular hydrogen atom, in a way which, if you knew enough about quantum mechanics, was totally impossible. But it would be, but first of all, if you didn't know about it, it wouldn't be interesting religiously, and I don't think we'd count it as a miracle. A miracle is a communication. And so if God doesn't make sure you know about that manipulated hydrogen atom, then it's not a miracle. But even if you know about that, it's such an ambiguous, minuscule, pointless disruption of natural law. I think you'd be right to wonder if God was behind it at all or not, right? It's on the other hand, God could do all kinds of things without breaking natural law. That would much more clearly indicate, here I am, I'm God, or at least I'm something way, way outside your pay scale. And here's what I'm telling you. It tells you something specific. I mean, like, if you look at Augustine's case, and again, I'm not sure if I'm that blown away by Augustine's own example. Maybe Augustine himself wasn't being skeptical enough, but it's a nice, fairly simple example of the kind of thing we're talking about.
Yeah.
In Augustine's example, there's nothing you can point to that's a clear violation of natural law. The kid is sing-songing, tolle lege, tolle lege. Augustine flips open a book, his eye flits at a certain passage of the book. I mean, all of that could have happened totally within the bounds of natural law. And if you think about it, if all the three elements there, Augustine's eye, the flipping of the physics operating on which page falls open, the wind and whatever else is operating, and the child's own stream of cause and effect, those three things, in fact, just came together without any disruption of their own natural course. That actually is better evidence of natural mastery, in my view, than a disruption of natural law. Because if you think about it, that if the things really do come together in this sort of harmonized way, which demands an explanation. And then you look at each element in the harmonic event, and each element actually was just obeying its own track of cause and effect. Then you got to think, well, I guess the thing which is communicating here has total knowledge over and power over the natural system, such that sort of from the beginning of time, when the causal chains of each of these three things was beginning, so to speak, it was arranged that at this day in the year 346 AD or whatever it was, these three things would come together in Augustine's, range of perception to communicate something very specific to him. So something that disrupts natural law. I mean, even when you establish, natural law has been disrupted by an agent, it just shows that agent had particular power at that time and place over that thing they disrupted. But if everything in the event is following natural law, that implies they had some kind of foresight and more total power over the system, right? So I very much agree with you that the natural-supernatural distinction is really not a thing we should start with.
Yeah.
And
it's just it's a non-starter when you're I sort of like philosophers when they're assessing miracles. So someone like Richard Swinburne has written an entire book on miracles and that sort of thing. And the way they translate Dembski's specified complexity is they'll say, well, first of all, an event has to be extraordinary. So that's the word I use, right? So it's kind of consistent with the ancients. They would look for signs or wonders, and these were remarkable events. It doesn't matter whether it's natural, supernatural, but they're marked out as this is not the way ordinary nature happens. There's something marked out about this event, whether it's providence or not, and also the specificity. So in terms of miracles, that would be the religious context that imports the significance of this remarkable event's occurrence. It provides a context that, this is what this event was meant to signify in terms of the communication. And that's the way I sort of translate Dembski. Oh, go ahead.
I guess I'm a little unclear on how you separate the two. I mean,
the religious context from the extraordinary?
The extraordinariness of the thing, it will be determined by what is actually happening, right? And part of what is happening includes the context of the communication. Maybe what I'm saying is not surprising. I mean, it sounds like Dembski is analyzing this communication, these two elements, and in analysis we often pry things apart that in reality have a complicated intertwining, but we can, with thought, pry them apart a bit. But I think maybe an example would help to clarify the distinction for me.
Sure. So in terms of the specification, which is what I relate to the religious context, this has to be independent of the event itself. So if you think of the example of a target with a bullseye, the target is the specification. That provides the independent pattern where we can interpret results. Whether I ever shoot an arrow into the bullseye or not, we can understand the pattern of the target. It's a delimited pattern, and it's detached from the event of shooting the arrow at its occurrence. Then the event itself, I shoot the arrow and it hits the bullseye. You can debate, well, the event's occurred, it's been actualized, is it complex? Is it highly probable? Is it a medium probability or a small probability? Obviously, me shooting an arrow into the bullseye is not a complex event and that sort of thing. So we wouldn't say that's a miracle or what I call a G belief authenticating event. But do you get how the pattern is detachable? So with a miracle, the religious context provides a pattern where we would expect God to be, if this is true, he would be authenticating this message through these complex events. Yeah.
I see. So in this analogy, you're God. If you're shooting the arrow, the authentication is the arrow shooter, or the shooting of the arrow.
Yeah.
And the target would be locus of reception, including its cultural context. No, that's a very useful distinction. I guess in
Minus
reality,
the blasphemy,
if the act is shooting the target,
yeah,
right? So the target, the act itself is already contextualized. In reality, it's one act; it's shooting the target.
yeah.
And but anyway, I think maybe I'm just analytically nitpicking a bit.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I think you're getting onto the topic of fulfillment of prophecy, where the target might be particular. The context to the target here might be particular expectations a religious culture gives its people, like a messianic fulfillment. Or events.
And just to clarify, so when you say prophecy here, you mean predictive prophecy, like you predict the future and that.
In this case, In this case, it's specifically, like the messianic prophecies of the one to come.
Yeah, I would just qualify. So that's true. That predictive prophecy case is probably the clearest example of specified complexity. But we can also identify it after the fact. It doesn't have to. The specification doesn't have to come before the event. It just has to be detachable from it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Anything else about identifying? I think we covered everything. Is there anything I missed or?
Not that I can think of.
All right. Well, let's move on. All right. Gosh darn it, Dale and Paul. I can hear the skeptic saying, "Fine. Pretend we can identify these intelligent communications." Who cares? It's how do we identify who the communicator is? Who is the designer? What are your thoughts on this? How could we possibly go about? We've got this message. How do we go about identifying who the communicator or designer is? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I like these different levels of skepticism. So there's within a thoroughly religious culture, the skeptic might be just one who does not doubt the reality of these communication links, but they're wondering whether they're demonic or angelic, or whether someone is speaking through God or something else.
Yeah.
And that's an excellent question too. I mean, you want to establish that you're being talked at, and then you also want to figure out who's talking to you and why. And you should tread this ground very carefully. I mean, there are all kinds of warnings against mortals tangling with the gods, and in the realm of communication, the risk is, first of all, you will misinterpret what the benign entities are telling you and cause great harm to yourself and to your people.
Mm-hmm.
And the second possibility is that you will receive instructions from what you take to be a benign entity, and it's in fact malign. And you should expect that if these beings are powerful, including the demonic ones,
mm-hmm.
they will be very good at presenting themselves to you as good. So good that they might fool a species for 3 trillion years. A whole species' religious history might in fact have been interaction with a demon, which had, like Hamlet's uncle, taken over Denmark.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, this is the Gnostic view of reality, that reality has been co-opted by a fallen god or a half-conscious god, and the true god has somehow been displaced, dethroned, and depending on how deep you want your Gnosticism to go, I mean, this displacement maybe happened at the beginning of time. By the time we get in the beginning, the displacement has already happened. And the whole history of reality as we know it has been the history ruled by something demonic. So again, when you open up to the world of gods, the ground is falling out from you a little bit. Whatever your current ground is, whatever you take to be the stable baseline premise of your operation, I think will start to shake a bit. And if you're coming to it from a Christian perspective, I guess when you start to interact with the gods, you have to be open to, just by respect for the majesty of the gods, you need to respect that you're easily fooled. And not just you, but a whole culture can be fooled. But how the criteria for distinguishing.
Well,
It's
before you get into that, maybe also just outline, well, what are some of these types of entities? So I know you sort of taught us that, was it Carl Jung who divided it up into three types of entities, or?
I think that was Terence McKenna.
Oh, okay.
In his conversation with Ralph Abraham and Rupert Sheldrake, talked about three types of entities. I guess in his usage, entities were just strange conscious phenomena that impinged on our experience, and then we can ask, well, are they natural phenomena? So some entities will turn out to be purely natural phenomena, which could include, aliens. We're still genuinely weird things like protoplasmic ghosts and aliens, but ultimately natural phenomena. Some, I think, one of the categories of entities was a Jungian category. These would be entities who have semi-independent existence from us, but they're ultimately in their history projections of our own consciousness. But again, they can be very weird projections which now have a kind of independent existence. So, a poltergeist haunting a Victorian manor may have originated from someone's frightened consciousness in 1832, and but now, that phantom, it has independent existence, but it has this natural origin in human psychology. And then the type 3 entities were genuinely, supernatural beings that have independent existence and don't have a natural history or natural origin point. So, I think again, whether it's 3 or 30, it's a weird and wonderful reality out there.
Yeah.
And it's a rich ecosystem, I think, is the way McKenna would put it, and it's richly populated. So you got to start to do something like Linnaean classification. If you're at all interested in it, you're going to start to sound a little bit like a zoologist. You start to categorize the types, and some of these beings, some of these animals want to eat us, and some of them don't. Some of them we can enter into sort of symbiotic relations with, and some of these entities want to eat us, or they want to eat Earth, or they want to eat reality, and metabolize its energy, and some of them want to help grow this little garden. So the things we interpret as good are the ones that want to help grow the garden of Earth, and the ones we interpret as evil are the ones who want to demonically ingest the Earth. Maybe apocalypse. I mean, if the demon who wants to destroy the world, we ask, well, why do they want to destroy the world? Well, maybe they want to eat it. Just like, they want to break it down and have it entropically release a lot of energy, and then consume that energy and move on. And maybe they're not, in the grand scheme of things, they're not evil. They're just a predator in this ecosystem, and we're the prey. But it's our right and our duty as prey to defend our home turf and to fight against this thing, and to be suspicious of it and protect our children from it.
Excellent. So, okay. So yeah, my original question then, how would you go about, or how could one in principle go about identifying which entity is responsible for something?
Yeah. Very carefully, but at the same time, using what you already know from communication within the natural world with other humans and other creatures. And part of the rule here in communication theory, especially if we get it from a bit of a Darwinian lens, is we should expect more than just words. We should expect action. We should expect the communication to include behavior. And, talk is cheap. And an entity can tell you it cares about you, but you should also see evidence of its care. Of course, that's not enough. If I'm a demon and I want to trick Earthlings into doing my bidding, and I think Earthlings are basically good, I'll present them as good, and I'll not only say, hey, I'm good, and you should do what I am advising here, I'll also do some things for them. I'm thinking here that there's a television series in the 1980s, widely watched, called V,
Mm.
And it was about aliens who land on Earth in these huge hovering motherships over all the major cities, and they present as benign. They right away hold a press conference and give us the cure to cancer, I think. And we're won over, but actually they're here to suck up all of the Earth's fresh water and to turn us into a factory farm.
Mm.
And but they know the way to co-opt the earthly system is to impress them with your supposed benevolence. So even actions, the aliens acted. They gave us a cure to cancer. They didn't just say they would, they actually gave it. And we would expect gods would do great things for us too.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, you got to look at the long history of a relationship too. You got to at some point go outside your own experience and look at your culture's relationship with these entities. You got to triangulate your experience with other reported experiences from your culture and its history, and start to say, I think the thing I'm talking to is it's Gabriel, or it's Jehovah, or it's Shiva, or it's the Muse, right? It's got personality, it's got specificity. The God on high, the hidden, does not speak. It has no personality. It's unmarked by characteristics. But the being that talks to us takes on personality, and it'll have a history with us, hopefully. And so judge very carefully and try to triangulate your experience with others who've had similar experience, and look at the history of this thing's behavior with our species. But be ready to have the rug pulled out from you too. I think.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, here's one way that I've come up with, and I might be interested in just getting your take on this. So, obviously, as a Christian, I explained to you my notion of G belief authenticating event criteria. How that's how we sort of identify this message is designed for the purpose of authenticating a religious message. And when I talk about religions, the way I sort of look at them is I define their main aim is to teach us as humans how to achieve our ultimate purpose in reality or creation or whatever you want to say. So what it is and how we can go about achieving that. That's just sort of my definition of what a religion is. So it would include things like Buddhism or Christianity or Islam, but it would exclude things like Confucianism, which is more like or Marxism, something like that. So given that, I think that we can establish that God exists. So he's the communicator as a maximal great being. And given that God obviously has certain goals in creating, as a maximally great being, who's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, and all of that, pretend that's established through independent grounds. As a free agent who freely chooses to create, there would be God outcomes for his creating, and that would include for his creating, whether directly or indirectly, human beings. So if there is these events, these designed communication events, regardless of whether that comes directly from God or through another agent, even Satan or something like that. Pretend Satan rose Jesus from the dead, and he thought, haha, I'm tricking people. Because God is a maximal great being, he could not allow for what I call undue confusion to result. So if Satan raising Jesus from the dead, just as an example, he thought he was doing that as a trick, and that leads to as many, more people not fulfilling their ultimate purpose, then that's what I call undue confusion. God cannot allow that to happen. So, reasoning in this way, we can say God was allowing Satan to do that, and it was conducive to us. Satan thought he was tricking us, but actually, no, we're achieving our ultimate purpose because he did that.
I think you've got the outlines of a criterion there. Just in the application, again, beware, mortal, who now speaks with gods. Beware that what you think is undue is not undue. God is in a very long game here, and God maybe allows nervous systems to exist in a kind of torture chamber for 300 million years before the game of civilization even gets going. And I mean, God may be operating in a very long game here. God obviously allows all kinds of confusion to take hold
That's
on
true.
Earth.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't pick a scale: centuries, millennia. I mean, so I agree again that you have an outline of a criterion here to mark off benevolent divine communication from non-benevolent, but figuring out whether the resurrection case was demonic or divine is tricky. I mean, that's where I'm not a Christian and you are.
Yeah.
Right? That's where you got some, and I know you're not unthinkingly falling back on these grounding premises, but I guess I'm just a little more willing to entertain the idea that that's demonic too, and in this phase the demon is winning, or in God's long game, that event, the resurrection of Jesus and the suffusion of earth life with Christianity, is actually on balance a very bad thing. That's possible. I mean, that's such a complex sociological calculation. I hesitate to even offer a guess, but partly because of that complexity, I'm very open to the possibility that Christianity, spurred by an actual resurrection event, has been demonic, or it's been on balance very bad for us. It's been a path we would have been better off not going down. I don't know. It's so complicated.
Sorry.
And I can say all that without saying anything against Jesus of Nazareth, except perhaps wondering whether he was duped a little bit. I mean, he went to the desert looking for God, and he met Satan, right? I mean, John the Baptist tells me you got to go to the desert to hear God, and or maybe I'm thinking of the Cousin Zachas version, but anyway, Jesus goes to the desert to concentrate his mission and to receive a pure communication away from the tribe, and really receives a direct communication from Satan, a direct encounter. And Satan promises him he'll be kind of Lord of the world, Lord of all history, and that came to fruition, just not in the way a king of Judea of that time may have expected. They may have expected they'd return from the desert resplendent in a train with 50 stallions and all the herds of the earth and literal keys to the literal kingdoms. But in fact, Jesus was granted mimetic dominance of cultural history. The Jesus meme is the most powerful meme in cultural history of the last 2,000 years, and it's dominated our great art and music until very recently. And I mean, even if you think of Satan promise, what kinds of things does Satan promise? Satan promises, to a man who's dancing with celibacy, he'll promise him access to all the women of the world. And Jesus got a version of that too. Not Jesus of Nazareth historically, but the Jesus meme. I mean, a nun is someone who forsook mortal men for a marriage with Jesus, and the nun is just an extremification of a tendency which is there in all true pious Christian women, right? Which is to really direct a lot of their heart's energy to the Jesus meme, and so in so many interesting ways, the satanic promises come to fruition historically. On balance, I don't think that's evidence that Satan was actually dominant in that whole operation. But I'm just saying there's a way you can read it all where Satan is actually winning this round of the battle. And Jesus is not a Satan worshiper, but Jesus was someone who was co-opted by this very, very powerful entity. How powerful? Powerful enough that maybe the best human whoever arose was, and the one with one of the clearest links to the other world was co-opted by it.
So one thing I could say about that, so in the first place, just as a yes or no type deal, pretend we can establish that God does exist and he's a maximal great being. If he has outcomes, you would agree that it's reasonable to presume that he would do whatever is logically possible within his abilities to fulfill that goal, right? If he's an intelligent agent that has a designed end goal in mind, he would take measures to fulfill that, right? Like that's not controversial, is it?
It's just, the goal itself could be something like allow a space of free play for free entities
Yeah,
for a long period of time, come what may.
yeah,
It may be that that's from behind this veil of ignorance. That's what we all entered into willingly. We knew we were entering into a free space of play. And that part of what makes it wonderful and different from heaven and different from just the undifferentiated awesomeness of perfect being is genuine risk. And it could be that what we call the universe is a big play box in which we were sent and which we willingly went, knowing, our souls knowing that anything could happen here.
yeah,
In the great
yeah.
game, Satan can win. All could be woe and destruction, and will be returned again. I mean, there's a promise that you shall be returned, or the promise is that whatever happens, your deepest self won't regret that you did it. Right in the end, when we return to heaven, so to speak, or maybe literally.
Yeah.
We say, you know what? I'm still glad I did it, and I would do it again. That was awesome. Can I go down the slide again? That would, I mean, in terms of theodicy, that would totally get God off the hook for me, no matter what happens down here. So then, what happens down here is, to me, quite open.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it could be that what God wants is for us to battle it out with Satan and let's see what happens. This is interesting.
Yeah.
And Satan could win. I mean, what an interesting way for Satan to win, too, by co-opting our best emissary. If as a Christian, you've got to think Jesus is at minimum the best person we put forward to the gods, for a comm link.
Yeah.
And that's a very minimal, Christology. And it would be very interesting if Satan wins by co-opting that soul to lead us like the shepherd. I mean, this analogy of the shepherd is very ominous when you think about the human relation to the animal herd. The shepherd, the crook of the shepherd, is there to yank the necks of these animals, and the shepherd is ultimately leading them to the kill box to have their throats cut and have them hung up by a leg, and to separate lamb from other. And I mean, the shepherd metaphor, that is the dominant metaphor of the Judeo-Christian world for God and for the Savior, it's got this dark side to it, which is this being is actually leading us to something which is not good for us, and we think it's our friend, and maybe it thinks it's our friend too. The shepherd likes the sheep and cares for them, but the shepherd's a bit of a dupe in the larger system. The shepherd is working for the herd king, the king of the herd, the great patriarch, who's indifferent to the fate of the shepherd and the herd. And I'm not saying this is what Jesus was. I'm just saying this is a possibility.
Yeah.
And it's one which God might even allow. And you talk about Jesus being the great sacrifice. This would actually fit the Christology of the sacrifice, right? That the sacrifice of Jesus is that he played the great Judas of history without meaning to. But in fact, he was the one who led us astray and allows Satan to win. That's the deep sacrifice. It's not just hanging on a cross for a day or two. I mean, or for a few hours, actually. And I think Jesus of Nazareth got off pretty easy. As far as crucifixion goes as an ancient punishment, his was mercifully short, I believe. But the greater sacrifice would be something more, ontological.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, and I've been very non-specific. So, if God is the indifferent king and not the shepherd, then yeah, the shepherd, even though he's thinks he's working against, he's still being consistent with the end goals, whatever those end goals would be. It's going to be conducive with the maximal great being's end goal. That's the only thing that I'm saying here. And here's an example.
Oh yeah, no, I think we agree there. I'm just saying the end goal might be to allow humans to battle with Satan, right? And that could be a very worthy end goal, and one again we all agreed to. But,
gotcha. Yeah. So you're sort of taking issue with how do we identify what the end goal is. I think that's what you're getting
Yeah,
at. Okay.
yeah. You're throwing yourself into the realm of mystery when you enter into this relationship. I mean, human to human relationships have so much mystery, and you never have totally figured them out. And it's one of the great plot devices of human, romantic storytelling. The great twist to be the one you thought loved you was in fact betraying you the whole time, or they stopped loving you, and that possibility is there inherent in any real relationship. There's an openness in any relationship and a mystery to it and an inexhaustibility to the other person, that there's always a possibility there that they're betraying you in a very, very deep way the whole time, or that this thing ends, or and I just think in human to divine relationships, it's often just what you find in the human to human level, but more so. So in the human to divine relationship, you should expect that, but more so that the love maybe is deeper, and the fruits of that relationship are greater and have greater span. But so too then would be the correlative possibilities of inversion or betrayal or mistake. You were misinterpreting the signs.
Yeah.
So I think
that's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's what distinguishes the true prophets from those who just receive the message secondhand from the people coming down from the mountain. The mountain is metaphoric, and going up that mountain it stands for many things, but part of it means leaving behind a lot of presumptions of the tribe. And you're going really far out, so you're going to the desert or up into a mountain, and you're leaving behind home. And home is epistemologic, partly. It's the things which give you a secure sense of where you're going and what you're entering into a relationship with, and what will come of it. It's the people who receive the word from the prophet, they have great certainty, right? Just like the people who listen to the kind of browse TED Talks on the new physics, they've got a sense that we've got it all figured out. And it's the people doing the new physics who are just aware of all the unanswered questions. And it's the prophets who go up the mountain who are aware of God's mystery, which includes, are you good or bad? I mean, are you going to destroy me or lift me up? Should I fear you or love you? And those who know God fear him, right? What does that mean? Well, that can mean something even like those who know God know that you're not even sure if it's what you had called God before you went up the mountain.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to get your take on something quickly here, if you don't mind, because I haven't. I want to propose. So in the first place, in terms of whether the end goal is good or not, I think that would be sort of covered. Well, is he a maximal great being or something like that? Is that provable? But more importantly, your point about being cautious about, but what is the message? What is it he's trying to communicate? Is he authenticating that Christianity is true, for example, or whatever it is? If we can prove he flew on a horse or split the moon in half or something, does that prove Islam is true? And I actually made a more nuanced thing in my own case. So I don't even presume that the fulfillment of G belief authenticating events proves that a religion is true. I only go for it means that God wants me to follow that religion as though it's true. So let's pretend it's actually the case that aliens rose Jesus from the dead, that it wasn't supernaturally risen. The religious message of Christianity is false in reality. And unbeknownst to me, I don't know that because I've identified Jesus was risen from the dead, and I think that proves that God wants me to follow Christianity. He was using these aliens doing a prank to follow Christianity until I learn differently. So it could be 20 years from now. The aliens show up and say, haha, I got you. We did that. We used our beaming up technology and reconstituted him or something. So at that time, I would say, okay, well, I no longer believe. But it could be that God used those aliens to have me become a Christian for those 20 years to achieve his goal, like to meet you or meet David and do that sort of thing. Who knows what
Yeah.
it was? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. Again, the communicator can use a variety of media,
Mhm.
and the media can include other persons, including alien persons, and our whole messages from civilizations. So when Sati finally does receive that pulse of prime numbers or whatever it is, it will be certainly an event in the natural history of galaxial civilizations. It could also be riding on that a divine event. It could be, there could be a numinous religious element inescapably to that kind of communication, and that could be part of the real content of the message. That this is from aliens, but it's also from the gods. Just like the movement of the birds is movement of birds, and it's also a message from, the Roman gods. So yeah, I like that. Again, thinking of just this great hierarchy of being, or just so many levels and a rich ecosystem. Things co-opt other things, and we rarely have the last word on what what is behind something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I think we're in agreement there. Just for the Christians in the audience, I'll just clarify that isn't what I believe. I do believe that Christianity is true, but I am open to, if we 20 years from now, if we get undeniable proof that no, aliens come and they said they did it, that's a possibility that I'm open to, and I'll stop being a Christian at that point. But I'll believe that God wanted me to follow the religion for those 20 years. Yeah, I don't believe that is the case. I don't believe that aliens rose Jesus, just so people know. All right, cool. All right, Paul. So I want to move on. Now, what about, are there any examples of bad prophecies or bad communications that happen from these higher powers? So, often skeptics will point to things like the hiddenness of God, and they'll say that this shows he's a bad communicator. That this higher power can't be that great because I can. I think Andrew gave one example in a round table we did. Andrew Knight from the Ask an Atheist Anything podcast, and he was saying, "Look, I'm a better communicator than God or this higher power. I can send an email with a clear subject matter and." Here's what I think. Here's what I want. I can be more specific. So, yeah. What do you make of this issue of bad communication from these higher powers? Yeah.
Yeah, it is a problem. It does seem that God could, in all sorts of ways, communicate to all nature in a pretty unambiguous way, right now. And so there's definitely a question of why that doesn't happen. And, there may be good theological reasons for why God doesn't communicate in such an obvious way. I mean, even to the sinners, the fallen sinners whose epistemic faculties are ridden with bugs. There's all sorts of ways we can, starting with omnipotence or something close to it, or maybe not even that close to it. We can imagine all kinds of communications that could take place to that fallen epistemology. And so it's a fair question. It's one of the things that theodicy has to wrestle with. Theodicy wrestles not just with evil, but with hiddenness more generally. So it's an ineliminable topic, I think. Bad communications, meaning in this case not malevolent necessarily, but just ineffective or broken or easily misinterpreted, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think probably it happens all the time. Wherever these links are established culturally or on a personal scale, some of the communication will be poor. Again, what you expect in the person-to-person realm, I don't see any great reason to keep out of the person-to-divine realms. So there's all kinds of misinterpretation that happens in any given minute of interpersonal, like human to human dialogue. And so I just assume there's that something like that going on all the time in human divine communication. So it's all fraught, I think.
So it's not necessarily the communicator
Right.
who's failing to have effective communication. It could be the listener who's okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it could be both.
Mhm.
I I like this idea that we know some things that God doesn't,
Okay.
and I mean they're just by being here on the ground in time and space, embodied. There's a way that we're familiar with. There's a phenomenology we have that maybe, in principle, a divine being couldn't have.
Mhm.
There's, and this is not sacrilegious at all. This is, in fact, part of what will justify the very creation of the world. Assumedly, if God's creating the world, it's for a reason. And assumedly, if there's a reason, there's something the world has that God doesn't. I think you can spin a version of that without being too impious.
Yeah.
And so it might be that, especially early in the comm link, there's some poor communication even from God's side, that God is a frustrated communicator, not just because he's speaking with perfect lucidity and we are, culpably ignoring or misinterpreting. It's that there's a tenuous link there because the two communicators are so different, and God's kind of got a history of learning how to communicate with us too. I think you see that if you take the biblical record at all seriously as a record of this of one particular cultural link with the divine. You see a real shift in the way God speaks from Moses and Abraham to Jesus and his Abba. And I just get the sense, my Gestalt impression is, without knowing Scripture really well, that God changed his style of communication too. Just like it reminds me of when some dads have two rounds of kids, maybe with a first wife and then later in life with the second wife, and sometimes they're with their second round of kids, they're a little bit more like a granddad. They're a little more benign and patient. And with the first round of kids, they were real harsh hockey dads. And you kind of get that sense with the old God and the new God. And I don't mean mean to make like a Judeo-Christian split necessarily here, but just this changing form of communication. So I like this idea, whether it's what's going on in reality. I like this idea of the gods too learning how to talk to us.
Yeah.
And so I'm not beholden to any really absolutist sense of what omnipotence actually cashes out as in real life. Real life is messy. If there's an omnipotent being, it created all this, and this is really messy. And it might be messy for a reason, but the communication might be part of the mess too.
That's interesting. Obviously, as a Christian, so I would disagree. I don't think God is a bad communicator. I do agree with you that we have certain forms of experiential knowledge that he doesn't. Not necessarily the example you gave, because Jesus did become incarnate and gained experiential knowledge of existing in the world, but certainly there are experiential forms of knowledge of sinning, like what's it like to tell a lie. He just has no clue what that feels like. And the other thing you mentioned, so I'm not sure that progressive revelation is necessarily a bad communication. You sort of agreed with that yourself, that there are certain the communicator or God can be limited by the recipient. So maybe at one time they're able to handle, learning to eat with a spoon or something, as an example. So he orders that, and then later on he says, well, you're more sophisticated, now you use a fork. Is it? Yeah, what would you make of? Is it wrong to link maybe progressive communications, where you get more and more information, with being a bad communicator? Like, does it have to all come at once to be a good communication? What do you think of that?
No, I agree with you there. I think we can distinguish between the conscious, progressive revelation, which we can imagine a God being totally in control of and not misspeaking in any way, but on our end we misinterpret it at various points. But you can also imagine that being modulated by some limitations on the divine's own comprehension of our experience. I mean, you mentioned that God doesn't have knowledge of what really the phenomenology of sinning.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine that God would be a little less forgiving and patient with us in his early communication, until he got a really rich sense through communication, through sharing of our experience, through a two-way link. He might be quite unforgiving at first because he's just so uncomprehending of sin. He doesn't comprehend how anyone could be tempted into it. And Satan is our friend, right? Satan's the friend of man. Satan is down here in the mess with us and knows exactly what it's like to be tempted and is completely, compassionately patient with the falling into temptation because he understands how powerful it is and how easy it is to turn your back on the truth and the good and reality, maybe, for some of these tempting objects. And so, you can imagine God, through that lacuna in his understanding, just becoming a better communicator, but becoming a more patient communicator and being a little more forgiving. To communicate effectively to someone, you got to show that you've got some sympathetic link with their form of experience. And you can imagine early on, God wouldn't have that, and God acquires that. And that's Jung's interpretation of the incarnation. In his essay on the Book of Job, he talks about through Yahweh's encounter with Job, like in Job's encounter with Yahweh, according to Jung, we see that Yahweh is very uncomprehending of humans. and there's a dual revelation happening there in that encounter. Certainly Job is meeting Yahweh quite directly through this medium of the whirlwind. But Yahweh is also meeting the creature in a very direct way and not quite comprehending. This is Jung's interpretation anyway. And according to Jung, after that encounter, Yahweh is motivated to enter history in the form of the incarnation, partly to soak up all the experience that he's been missing, that his creatures have been getting. So through the medium of the incarnation, Yahweh then learns what it's like to be a creature. And then the God after that, and even during that, is more forgiving and more like an Abba than a,
cool.
King of the herd or a distant father.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Yeah, I think that's good. The last section. So I know that you're not. I sort of misunderstood you when you were picking out the topic originally. I thought you had in mind predictive prophecies.
Oh yeah.
And I know that you're not a Bible scholar or a scholar in various religious scriptures and that sort of thing. So maybe just to sort of ask a generalized question about this form of predictive prophecies. In terms of being communications and that sort of thing, whether they're effective or not. Okay, we all know a clear example of a predictive prophecy. You predict, various elements of the future, and they come to pass. And wow, if it's sufficiently clear and the event in question that is predicted is extraordinary or complex or improbable, then you might have something there. But what about? So you'll hear in biblical studies, when you study the prophetic genre, things are not quite as straightforward. There are various prophetic devices, so things like multiple fulfillment. So you think part of the prophecy is fulfilled in 586 BC, and then another part by Alexander the Great in 322, or prophetic telescoping. You think that does that take away from the communication, like using those devices in that context?
No, it can, right? I think it's this double-edged, not double-edged sword, but on the one hand, you have to allow that this might be part of the language that the divine uses, that the God's words are big, and what we think is a word referring to a day is actually referring to a century. So you should partly expect something like telescoping in divine prophecy. On the other hand, the skeptic should be aware that, the skeptic in you should be aware that this opens up the canvas available to the interpreter and lets in so much data that the chances of you being able to pull out from that data field something meaningful increases radically, right? So there's no razor sharp distinction we can draw here to separate the incorrect from correct interpretation. I think we should expect weird things like telescoping and multiple fulfillment. But we should also expect that the creative human mind can use those extensions of the canvas to project prophetic fulfillment where it's not there.
Yeah, I think we had a guest. I don't know if you heard that show, but back when I was on SNS, we had Dr. Michael Brown on, who's he's an Old Testament biblical scholar and that sort of thing, and he really specializes in messianic prophecies to, reaching out to Jews and that sort of thing. But sort of along the lines of what you say about it sort of being a mess with all these things, he compares it to like a portrait where you can't really make out what it is. You're like, well, it looks like an old man to me. But if you tilt your head just slightly to the left, oh, it's a woman. Now you see it. Now you get the picture.
Right.
And once you see it, you can't go back. So that's what he compares prophecies as, is this sort of like, when you see it the proper way, you're like, how could I miss this before? But without that.
That's true of Pareidolia too, right? Once you see that, once your friend says, hey, that cloud looks like a pirate ship, it's very hard to unsee the pirate ship. It still might just be projection.
That's a good point.
But yeah, there are, I think I would agree with Dr. Brown that there are ways an interpretation can click. Click. You hear the click, 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 click.
Yeah.
And
good sound effects.
The message should really click on multiple levels and in ways that defy probability, like you talked about. And I think we're all on the same page here.
Okay. My last question before I give you sort of time to give your closing statement then. Again, I'm going to generalize it because I know that you're not a fan of like getting into messianic prophecies and that sort of thing, but just in general.
I would be. I have such limited knowledge about it. I wish I could have that discussion. But.
Oh no, yeah, no worries. I want you to shine in what you're knowledgeable. I want you to share your knowledge, right? So, okay. Well, just in general, then, let's pretend it is this mess. We can't distinguish between predictive prophecies and pareidolia or these other things, but there's some kind of element that's unique in a certain way compared to other similar prophecies, like predictive prophecies compared to other religions. Would the uniqueness itself justify inferring this is a communication, a prophecy in terms of communication, or is the uniqueness just not relevant, or does it depend? Yeah, what's your make on the uniqueness factor?
I don't know about uniqueness. I mean, the message should be special. I mean, if it's coming from out, if it's not local, if it's not human, it's not reducible to the natural and the social, then it's got to be special. Unique is at the furthest end of that spectrum of specialness, right? It's unique means absolutely special, and I don't think I'm not sure if that needs to happen in history for it to be marked as divine. Again, you might expect, just from the theory of God, that God would, by God's majesty and interest in human flourishing or something, communicate multiply, not uniquely. And or you might expect that God would transmit a unique message, a very specially marked peak. In the history of communication, there should be a very distinct peak there that all Earth life can turn its attention to. I'm not sure which expectation you should prefer by the theory of God alone. And I'm not sure in history what's happened. It's totally expected. You're going to have peaks and valleys. Again, no communication can be a wall of sound. There's no differentiation there. There's no dynamics. And so there's no meaning. And you'll see that on just the level of sentence by sentence, person to person. And you'll see that on the level of God speaking to a species over history. There will be peaks and valleys. And we shouldn't be blinded by some of our, universalist, multiculturalist sympathies to suppose that every culture will receive equally the voice of the gods. Some cultures might be particularly good at it. That might be, even if we're all working together, all humanity, it might be that some cultures are specialized in something like prophecy, and some cultures are really, just good at other things. They're good at building bridges, or good at building rocket ships. And so we should. I tend to expect you'll find these peaks and valleys. Uniqueness wouldn't surprise me if in the end it turned out that Jesus was the Son of God and was the purest reception we've ever received of the divine message. If that's what happened, I mean, okay. I guess that's the way God worked this round. What actually happened, though, I don't know.
Interesting. Perfect. Okay, well, yeah, thank you. That covers all of the questions that I had prepared to discuss with you there. I guess before I close out the show, I'll just turn it over to you to make sort of any closing statement or anything that you want to end the show with.
I don't know. I think we covered quite a bit there, eh?
Yeah.
That was really interesting. Really interesting couple hours of discussion, and I'm not sure I have anything to add.
You said it all. But, well, that means I did my job then. I covered everything. Well,
this is part of an ongoing dialogue we're having about prophecy and other things, so I'm sure we'll pick it up at some point.
Absolutely. Perfect. All right. Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much, Paul, for being willing to put up with me and talk to me.
You're a really, really wonderful communicator, and so my pleasure.
Excellent. All right. So next week for the audience. So on Saturday, I'm actually rejoining up with my old skeptical co-host David Johnson. He's going to be having a discussion with a Christian from the Unbelievable Boards, Marvin Wallace. So I'm sure most of the audience will know him. They're going to be discussing the meaning of life and whether God is necessary to have a meaningful life. Look out for that, and have a good week, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye, Paul.